Hello, everyone, to the latest episode of the Coffee Chat on 365 Adoption. I'm Daniel Glenn.
I am Sarah Hosey. Nice to be here.
And where is here, Sarah Hosey?
We are in Chicago and in the land of snow globes.
Snow globes.
At SharePoint Fest,
That's
Chicago.
Right. That is right. We are here in Chicago, SharePoint Fest, which we've been here before at SharePoint Fest doing this podcast, having a great time.
Isn't this where we kicked off our first episode was actually in Chicago?
It is, Sarah Hosey. Good memory.
Wow.
So today, I kind of want to talk about how we came up with the topic that we're going to talk about today.
Before we do so, can we acknowledge the folks that have attended in person? So in addition to recording this for you all, we are recording it live, and we do have some wonderful SharePoint Fest Chicago attendees. So we're going to pause and ask if you have any questions later on in the show, but thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. So we were coming up with the topic, and we happened to be, at the time, sitting around the table with a few friends at a restaurant eating deep dish pizza.
Right, Chicago deep dish pizza.
It was delicious. Ooh, it was delicious. A great time we had. It was had by all, I'm sure. But it was there that we talked about what topic should we cover when we're talking about this adoption in Microsoft 365. And what really came out of that was...
Oh, I get to share it?
Sure.
So we had several different ideas going around the table, but the one that we really solidified on is the idea that is self-service critical to adoption? Is self-service by our users key to the adoption process? Can a lack of self-service negatively impact your organization? On the flip side, can self-service negatively impact your organization? Mm-hmm. So how do those two concepts interrelate?
Yep. So I think some of this came from really the Microsoft introducing this concept in for the Power Platform, but it's not a new concept, right? We've been talking about self-service we're here at SharePoint Fest. Let's talk about SharePoint. In SharePoint for a long time, does it require approvals for site creation, for instance? Do we have to have IT involved when we're doing site creation or creation or adding users? Does that how do users get added to sites? Is it through AD groups or is it through SharePoint groups and et cetera, et cetera? So we've been talking about this for a while.
Back in the way back days, I actually know several organizations that I worked with that back when you were creating site collections, not only were they not self-service, they would charge you for a site collection because that's how they manage their IT services, and they thought it would combat sprawl of SharePoint sites. Now, back then was only 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Wow. Wasn't that long ago, but many companies used to actually charge or manage those site collection requests, so not only not self-service, but not free. Right. In the sense that the company's already paid for it, you must pay an additional fee to get a site collection.
Right, and I was part of an organization just like that. IT was a cost center, and we had to recoup the value that we were providing to the business, and so the business had to pay us for everything that we provided. It was an interesting environment, I'll say that. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is self-service a requirement for organizations when you're talking about adoption and wanting good adoption for your organization. So where should we start, Sarah, on this journey of discovering what position is correct?
So maybe we should start with the principle of what self-service adoption, what we mean by it when we say it, and what would it look like, and then we can talk about some of the impacts and then really debate both sides of the equation. Should we roll out Office 365 and have all of the end user, citizen user functions be self-service enabled or not?
I like the idea.
Perfect.
So definition for self-service. My definition of self-service is providing a method to allocate resources, whether that's sites, that's licenses, that's whatever it is, without needing to involve anyone else.
Okay.
So no kind of workflow approvals, no opening help desk tickets, nothing. It's I push a button and it happens.
I think my definition of self-service as it relates to Office 365 is going to be different. That's not shocking. A little bit more pragmatic. To me, self-service could mean automated processes, automated workflows that enable me to create something. But it's basically having an immediate action. Someone wants a new Yammer group. They want a new SharePoint site. They want a new planner plan or a new team. And there is the shortest path possible, meaning seconds, and only a few seconds between them somehow requesting that and receiving it without a significant delay due to approvals and processing within the company. Now that self-service could be powered by workflows and scripts and things that are running. Not that every user in the company is going to have the authority or access rights to create all that, but that we're trying to stop the gap, mind the gap, shorten as much as possible so request fulfillment are right next to one another.
Okay, fine. I want to say I agree with you. I don't want you to hold it over me for years, but this one time...
It's only the second time it's happened.
You might want to write this down. I agree with you. I think self-service can be a process. There could be a process involved there, especially when you're talking about if someone has to be added to, I mentioned AD groups earlier, someone has to be added to an AD group,
right.
Then automating that process to add them so they actually have access to things. Okay, fine. I agree with you. You could have some workflow, you could have some process behind it, but it has to be pretty quick.
And not require manual intervention or manual approval on the path. So
Right.
I think we agreed the major tenets of it are, it has to be something users can request what they need in Office 365 and they get it very quickly.
Okay, so we've defined it
Yeah.
for what we want to define it. So can I say that self-service is not the right way any company should go? Can I say that?
If you want to own that statement.
I don't really want to own the statement, but I feel like generally speaking, self-service as a method of driving adoption or enabling adoption of 365 can cause more trouble than it will enable the adoption.
And what trouble do you think it will cause?
Well, what I have seen is the working with organizations and having the problem of, I've now got the tool, great. What do I do with it? Well, I'm just going to do with it whatever I think I should do with it and run with it. I'm going to, if you give me, if I've provisioned Power BI through a process, whatever, and now I have a Power BI Pro license and now I can share, I'm going to just start connecting the stuff and creating it. And I don't, there's no, I'm going to make it look and feel the way I want it to. I'm going to start publishing things, and it's really not going to be up to any kind of standard, and it's not, the look and feel is going to be totally mine. It's not going to be what the company wants. And I've seen this happen many times where you have to go back and rein people in, to get them back into, okay, now we've got to work through this process of fixing what you just broke.
Yeah, but what you're talking about doesn't sound like any fun. And here's why I say, and fun is important when we're talking about user adoption in Office 365. We want our users, and in this case, I'm going to call them citizen users. And there's a reason why, and I'll come back to this idea. But our citizen users, they want to engage with the tool sets. Some of them want to explore. Not everybody. Some people are just really, I like the comfort of the tools that I know, but others are excited to learn this. And if we constantly tell them you have to read everything in triplicate and make sure you read the 8-point font, and you have to ascribe to all of these standards, and if you build it and it isn't good enough, then it doesn't have value. I think that could really be demotivating from a user adoption and a learning perspective. So could we take a little bit more of a mild approach? An extreme approach would be for me to say, in order to drive adoption, all users should have access to everything at will, create as they want to, and we would have sprawl and complete anarchy everywhere, right?
Isn't that what you're advocating for?
No.
Oh.
But what I would advocate for is that we need to have appropriate controls. So we want those citizen users to feel excited. I say citizen users because I think that they have some inherent rights of their own as it comes to Office 365 to play and learn. But we want them to explore new capabilities, but we want them to do it with a few guardrails around. So if we set some guardrail parameters that keep them within a relatively safe zone, could that work?
So you want to give them freedom as long as they stay within a narrow scope.
That depends on the company. Some companies in some industries need a much more narrow scope. If you're working in financial services, for example, you have a lot of regulations that you have to follow. So your scope should be drawn by the size of your company, the culture of your company, and the industry requirements and legal requirements you have. If you're working for a medical technology company, the constraints in the scope is going to take on a completely different shape than if you're working in financial services, in the insurance industry, government,
Education.
other public for-profit companies, retail companies. I mean, it's all going to look and feel different. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy. But I think what you've landed on, Daniel, is that they should evaluate first where are the outer edges of what they have to control.
Okay, so what you're suggesting is for organizations to take an approach of looking at technology, focusing on a solution like Power BI I brought up earlier, for instance, and saying, well, how do we want our users to use it? For instance, if we want common look and feel, how do we then communicate that to our users and enable them to use that common look and feel while doing provisioning on their own?
And a great example, when you're talking about SharePoint sites, we could set up a custom branded look and feel and use site designs and site scripts to make sure that even if we self-service enable the users to request their own SharePoint sites and to be able to procure them quickly, we could leverage site designs and site scripts to be able to put some of that frame around it from a company perspective that delivers what we need.
Okay, fine. It sounds like actually an okay idea. I'm not going to say good because then you might win this argument and that would be terrible. But the next thing I want to mention though, we started this off with, hey, remember back when we had to charge back to the business and blah blah blah, and it caused issues. Well, what about licensing, Sarah? We're going to allow users to self-provision, and then they're going to go out and say, yeah, I need to provision myself for Power BI Pro, which is $10 a month. I need to provision myself for, using Power Automate, Power Apps. The list goes on, and as well as the bill, it keeps going higher.
And this is where the enterprise manager resource in me, everything starts going like this and the shoulders start creeping up and suddenly you get a lot less calm. Definitely boundaries. Especially with Microsoft is rolling out some new, as you and I have talked about a lot, self-service purchase capabilities in Power Automate in January. And that's coming, and your users can go out and basically purchase licensing on their own with a personal credit card and have it automatically enabled in your tenant.
So and I think that's a little different, right, than other tools where we're talking about SharePoint, which typically is licensed for everybody in your company.
Right, but not all the tools are, as you said.
Right. So is it that we can we've landed on maybe we should look at the technology, come up with those guardrails, I think maybe, guidelines of look and feel or usability and take that approach. But should we also take a step back and look at services as well? Maybe for SharePoint, we can do that pretty easily using a site script and site designs so we can get the look and feel. We can also get the functionality that we want to add to those sites. But when we're talking about services that are licensed differently, everyone, like I said, everyone's got SharePoint probably in your organization, but not everyone has a Power BI Pro license maybe, or is a license to start creating flows in Power Automate so much.
Agreed. And I think it comes back to that bumpers and guardrails discussions that we had. If I could turn the conversation slightly, let's talk about something really practical that I've heard has hit up a lot of companies and caused challenges, Yammer. Yammer by definition is a product where you want people engaged in having those conversations. When you look at some companies, and I'll use Microsoft as an example, they really do enable Yammer group proliferation, right? People can create Yammer groups on almost any topic. Many companies, that scares them a little bit because they wonder, could I have 17 different groups about motorcycles? And should I not have just one Yammer group about motorcycles and not have a Harley Davidson group and a Yamaha group and all of these other things? But what becomes even more dicey is some of the groups that people want to have that don't represent the common interests of all employees, and how do you handle that? And usually HR, employee relations, corporate communications has some very definite ideas around the instantiation and automatic self-service creation of those Yammer groups. And that can be a touchy subject.
I agree. I have conversations with organizations talking about, creating these communities in Yammer, and I always, to get the feel of the people that I'm working with, I always bring up the cat lovers community in Yammer. Should you allow your organization to create a cat lovers community, right, or a dog lovers community, or a run group, people who go running, and just kind of gauge where people are. And you're right, when you're talking with some people it seems to be in those kind of HR communication groups, oftentimes are very, that's interesting. But I've had some conversations with organizations that are like, yeah, we already have one of those. Do you want to see my cat videos?
And some companies are open with it, but sometimes it scares them to be able to foster all of these cooking communities and things that are not related to work. They'd rather keep it related to work. But the magic secret sauce to Yammer is really sometimes, for many people, the pets Yammer community might be what brings them to Yammer every day. Where they go from that community to other communities might have a work purpose, but sometimes that level of integration about things that they're passionate about that are outside the four walls of work are very engaging.
Yes.
And those are the groups that I would consider neutral, because in general, do people have a distaste for cooking or a distaste for pets? It's non-work topics, but then we get into some groups that cause even more friction. So, and the reason why I bring this up is, if we want to foster creation of Yammer communities, Daniel, do you think that we should allow people at the point in time where somebody is in a meeting and says, we should have a Yammer community that focuses on the new AI capabilities and Power Automate? If they're talking about it in a meeting, do you want to enable them to create that Yammer group during the meeting, and it's there and they can start using it, versus them having to think, I've got to go request that from somebody else, I've got to have it reviewed and approved by IT, HR, corporate communications. They'll get back to me in a period of 7 days to 21 days, and then the group will exist and I'll get an email, but then I don't care because I have moved on, I'm done, and now the whole community idea is lost.
So your question is, do I need to go through that process? My answer is absolutely. And for two reasons. One is that there may already be a Yammer community talking about AI that it would be more appropriate for you to just use that community. You just don't know about it. So I don't want to create yet another community talking about the same thing, and you're not getting the information that's already out there in that community. The second is, let's change the topic from AI to something like, hey, person who shares my same religious beliefs, I think we should have a Yammer community around this religion. Should you have that in your workplace? Maybe, maybe not. So do you want me to go ahead and provision that? Well, if you provision it, then it's kind of de facto approved by the organization that you should have this.
Oh, but is it? And I think that those are the important conversations to have. Yep. On the first point, one of the difficulties when, if I say I want a new Power Automate AI group, and you say, well, wait, we've already got an AI group, let's put it in there. who decides what groups or Yammer communities should go together or not? For many Yammer users, they feel very particular about the community and the scope and focus that they want.
Yeah.
And sometimes lumping all 14 communities that talk about motorcycles into one community that talks about motorcycles doesn't do it justice, and it destroys adoption of those Yammer communities. So, and if it's some person who is not related to the content making the decision, that can be difficult.
I agree. I totally agree. However, I think some of the having a community for motorcycles, but then having the subtopics of different types of, I like this motorcycle theme. I like it. Having subtopics for Yamaha and Harleys, and I think is, it could work. Now it could not work. It depends on the organization. But I think that there has to be some sort of guidance for when you're creating this. And I'm not just talking about guidance of here's 5 things you should think about before you create this community. I actually think there should be that. But there needs to be something somewhere where people say, okay, you're requesting this AI and Power Automate, great, but there's already an AI group and they talk about Power Automate already. Or there's this AI group, maybe you should go look at it, this community, before you start doing this. But that's human intervention. So that's a process, and that's approvals, and that is not self-provisioning.
But I think that there's an opportunity to expand the way of thinking. So I've worked with several organizations where we've said, we're going to try and hold to a standard of, Daniel wants a new Yammer community. He's going to request the Yammer community in Yammer. It will be fulfilled. However, that doesn't mean that he is free and clear and no one's checking up on this and it's going to go forward. Do we put in some kind of an immediate 2-step part of the process whereby there is an automatic registration requirement for that Yammer community? You're required to be able to fill out some information. It's required to go through a series of checkpoints with HR Corp Common IT. If it is found to be duplicative, found to be against employee policy, because maybe now it is a group about people who share my religious beliefs or people who I don't like their religious beliefs and is inappropriate and against company policy, it would immediately get pulled down within a very short turnaround period. Could that be a compromise?
So instead of doing like an approval process or filtering before it's the provisioning, you're talking about coming after it's provisioned and saying, okay, it's created, you can get started, but someone comes along within a day and says, right, what is this you created? What is the theme? Is it appropriate?
Is it appropriate? And it could be a day or 2 days, again, depending on the business. Could be 3 hours. But somebody comes and then they pull the plug if the plug needs to be pulled.
Yeah, I feel like, and we've said this already, it depends, right? It depends on what kind of organization, what kind of vertical you're in. Even 3 hours could be too long to have a community that has a theme or has something that you don't feel appropriate. Right. But then that whole afterwards pulling down, that can be very political, and I don't mean politics, big P politics. I mean, it could be very political. It could be very, who is the person who's, the authoritative, I'm deleting this and making this decision, and then how does that get communicated, and how, is it that maybe you get 3 strikes, you're creating all these communities that are wrong and we're taking them down? Is there some sort of punishment? I mean, so there's a lot of...
You're absolutely right, and regardless of whether it's pre-approval before something gets created or immediately afterwards, how do you handle when a user says, yeah, but what I was creating had value, and so I want a second opinion. I want to escalate it to somebody else to think about it.
So now it's a governance board or something.
It gets complicated. It always gets complicated.
There's a rotating membership group. I mean, it's like the UN of Yammer communities.
It's exhausting.
I'm already exhausted just talking about it. I think it's a good idea, though. So anyway. No, I like it. I think do you remember this maturity scale, the we've talked about for a long time, and it started off with SharePoint. There was this maturity scale of where you are as an organization and what kind of features and functionality you're going to be using in the technology. I think that's in this what we're talking about. If you have what you described of a 3-hour type window or whatever it is, but it's this window of going back and looking at what was created. Is this appropriate? Having procedures that go through, whether that's approvals and decisions and all, that's very mature as an organization with self-service provisioning. So I feel like you're not going to be there immediately, unless you already do this in other areas. Right?
I think it's an excellent point because you're not going to get there immediately. But what we also have to be cautious of is, I've seen it happen in companies I've worked with. I'm sure you've seen it happen as well. They initially start off saying, we're just going to open it up for everyone, self-service, and we're going to see what happens. And guess what happens? Something bad.
Yeah.
Something bad happens. Somebody creates something that they really shouldn't have been creating. Somebody does something that they shouldn't have been doing. And then what do they immediately want to do? Do they want to do a laser-focused correction on that item? Or do they start to say, we are going to take a scorch the earth, or at least scorch this acre policy, and say, we need to shut that down? And then suddenly you're having very different conversations about Yammer's right to live, right? Or
Right,
other
yes.
applications, and that happens all the time.
Yammer's right to live. I like that. It does happen all the time. And so I think what we're talking about, and hopefully if you're watching this or here live, you're getting some ideas in your head about these communities, but also about your community, and meaning your company and your organization and the way you do things, and how could it be best implemented for your organization that it would actually work. Because the scorched earth or scorched acre, okay, that process can be very. It's like, okay, great, but you're I like to say throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're getting rid of a great functionality or technology just because someone or some people
Right.
did some bad things.
It's a correction over correction,
Right.
right? And the biggest thing is that I know that people oftentimes ask me, how do we do this the right way? And the reality is that there is no right or wrong way.
Right.
It's going to be a mix of creatively
Okay.
coming up with a solution that supports several key things that we know. Key thing one that we know, if we delay a user's request for something in Office 365, a request for a new SharePoint site, a new Teams team, a new Yammer community, if we institute a delay that is hours or days long, we're going to negatively impact adoption. Do you believe that to be true?
I agree, and specifically, I mean, the biggest thing and you mentioned this earlier, was this. I had this great idea. I put in the request, and then, we're not sitting around waiting for approval for days or even, multiple hours. If it's a 20-hour, 10-hour, 8-hour turnaround, we may lose that momentum, and that idea's gone.
Correct.
So I like the idea. Or that being one of the reasons why we may want
Right.
to go ahead and move forward.
So we have that as a driver. Then we have as a driver organizational needs and necessary controls. And those can be controls from a political perspective within our organization, from an HR perspective, from an IT perspective, even e-discovery controls, right? But we're going audits. If you're in the medical industry, insurance industry, financial industry, you're going to have audit records to be able to support what you're doing.
Right.
So I think it's important that we take a look at what do we want in terms of the best desired approach for our users in terms of how much can we keep that time short from when they request something to when they get it, and then what can we manage during that time, what can we automate about that management,
Yep.
and how we can best serve the needs. And if you approach the problem from that perspective, you're going to come up with your own flavor for your own organization that is hopefully a best fit of all of those needs.
So I agree. I think we definitely have to evaluate our organization, evaluate how we go step through the process. That first step is, I think, identifying and looking at what is the technology we're talking about, right? And we've been hitting on Yammer a lot here, but is it Teams? I mean, it could be Teams, it could be Planner, whatever. So we need to look at the technology. What are those nuances those differences between the technologies, how do we augment, and then we say, okay, how do we pair this up with the way our company works? And that first step is, once we do that, I think, is then talking about, okay, what is the process? What is what are the steps that our users are going to need to take to do self-service? And then what are the rules that we're going to have to put into place? And is it a cleanup afterwards? Is it a cursory approval beforehand that is short but guaranteed 1 hour turnaround kind of thing or something? Right. And then, though, I think it really is also thinking about the players that are involved and talking to them and saying, what is it that we as an organization need to be looking out for? We've talked about HR a little bit, but I also think we need to talk to finance people. If it has a financial impact, how is it that we enable self-service, but then also how are the costs managed? But then we also, I think, need to include legal and have them part of the conversation. What is it that we need to look out for? How do we need to protect ourselves so that we don't have to they don't come in later and do the scorched acre or scorched earth of coming in and saying, you did what? And you allowed them to do what? Okay, turn it off. Done.
Right.
You don't want that. So involve them at that beginning before you even ever start allowing people to click buttons. Does that sound right?
Sounds right to me.
Okay.
I think we need to wrap it up.
Okay. I think we have really covered this self-service. I want to mention that on the Power Platform, for instance, there's ways to turn it off for self-service for licensing. But when you're talking about usability, we talked about licensing a little bit, but usability is really the focus here. We're talking about adoption. So usability, licensing is part of it, but it is focusing on how you use it. So I think that, did we determine that I was correct?
No.
We are correct. How about that?
I think that's where
Okay.
we landed.
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
So a huge note of thanks to our friends, Deep Dish Pizza Night activity, coming up with a topic for the podcast today, and it really worked out well. So kudos to our friends for that. Thank you all.
Kudos very much. Thank you so much.
You know who you are.
Yes, thank you so much. We appreciate it. So for this episode, I think we've done a great job covering that topic. Yeah, thanks. So now I'd like to maybe open it up for questions at all for the live studio audience that we have here.
How about one question in the interest of time?
In the interest of time, there's one question. Anybody have a great question? People over to the right in the gallery, in the front, anyone? Some? Oh, I see someone in the back that actually was part of that dinner that came up with the topic. That's wonderful. Anyone? Question?
All right, that means we did it all.
We did a great job, I think.
Boom.
That's what
Or they didn't understand a single word we said. It was one or the other.
It's the one extreme or the other. Well, I want to say thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. Until next time, I'm Daniel Glenn.
I'm Sarah Halsey.
And have a good one. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. What are we starting off with? What did you say you want to do? Crowdsourcing? You said you want to talk about that first?
Really? You have no idea how to start off the show?
I know how to start off the show. I'm saying, what's the first topic? You've got the wrong position. I've got the right position. That's the debate we're going to have. You're going to be incorrect, and I'm going to be correct. Sarah, she really is comedy gold. Just not this early in the morning.
Bye, everybody.
Are you going to do the thing?
What is the thing again?
You look right into that camera and you say,
I know what you want me to say, but that's just because you make fun of me for it.
I don't make fun of you at all.
All right, Daniel, it's time to roll that beautiful beat footage.